It's another summer special from the British Broadcasting Century podcast with another fabulous author shining a light on a forgotten part of broadcasting history. Hello, I'm Paul Carenza. How are you doing? I, for one, am amazed how little there is out there about the very first black British broadcasters. Perhaps, as our guest Stephen Bourne implies, it's because we're a little uncomfortable about what we may find if we open too many closets in our broadcasting studios and our history archives. You know, about our attitudes or those of our, let's face it, our grandparents, our great-grandparents' generation. Surely, we may think, the BBC in the 1920s and 1930s was all white, mostly male, with the only black references being rather inappropriate song titles and dodgy entertainers. But if you look away because of that, you deny yourself a whole treasure trove of brilliant, pioneering, and above all, entertaining, underappreciated stars of early broadcasting.
The BBC were, I think, showcasing these artists and composers, and they don't give themselves enough credit for it. They think it's all black and white minstrels and Kentucky minstrels, and it's not. It's a much wider, diverse, and that's the interesting thing about the BBC as an organisation. They were culturally diverse in those times. And I've tried my best to acknowledge this in my work and to get this story out there.
We're bringing you these summer specials to shine a light on some marvellous books you can read this summer, perhaps, or any season. This time, the early black British broadcasters with Stephen Bourne. Oh, and we have a little musical treat for you from singer Cathy Tuan, recreating a song from 1913, one of the earliest songs about wireless.
There's a wireless station.
It's all on the second summer special with me, Paul Carenza, on the British Broadcasting Century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling. This is London calling.
Hello, Paul Carenza calling. Hope your summer's going well. Welcome to episode 51, kicking off our second half of our first century of episodes of the British Broadcasting Century in this centenary year, as we edge ever closer to the centenary day, week, moment, I suppose, of the BBC itself. Normally, this podcast offers you sand-timer-like detail. We bring you each grain of sand trickling down in the early broadcasting story, in which timeline we're up to February of 1923 of the early BBC. But now and then, we do specials, like this run of 3 summer specials. We're bouncing forwards just a little to some later broadcasting history nuggets. And each of these I've focused on a marvellous author. So last time Sarah Jane Stratford told us about Radio Girls. Next time Edward Sturton and others, in fact, including David Hendy and Tim Wonder, we'll try and sneak them on too, tell us all about Auntie's War, the BBC in World War II. But this time I'm going to use World War II as our sort of end limit, our parameter for this tale of early black broadcasters on the BBC.
Delighted to welcome to the podcast now Stephen Bourne, historian of Black Britain, writer of many books, and he's going to tell us more about this exciting early era of radio and TV and a black presence on there. Thank you for joining us, Stephen.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
So, Ed, I love the fact, so your books, you've written many books, which we will mention, including Black Poppies, Britain's Black Community in the Great War, Under Fire, Black Britain in Wartime, 1930-1945, Black in the British Frame, and Deep on the Roots, Trailblazers Who Changed Black British Theatre as well, quite recently, I believe. So all of those, that tells me it's like early 20th century, but it's also entertainment, but it's these underrepresented stories that you've been finding out for us.
Yes, and also important to point out, if I may, no words ending in ology. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a professor, not work in academia. So the reason I say that to you is just to simply fill you in with my background. I come from a working class background, so I came from a family that allowed me to watch as much television as I wanted. And I grew up, luckily, in the 1960s as a little kid and in the 1970s, but in the 60s especially, I saw everything from Blue Peter to Cathy Come Home. It was amazing kind of formative years.
I guess that then sends you down a certain path and you sort of dig around and I guess once you find these stories, is it like putting on a thread? You sort of go, oh, there's something there. And then no one else is really...
Oh, it's marvellous because you see the whole thing about BBC radio particularly. I've done extensive research and done my own little database of pre-war BBC television, from Alexander Palace mainly, all those programmes, the Black Presence, that I do know. But the radio needs more attention and more systematic research. And it's impossible when, sorry to sound like a chip on my shoulder, but it's almost impossible to raise funds, to get funding for that kind of research. If you work outside academia, that's the point I'll make. So if you work in isolation as I'm sometimes referred to it as an independent scholar. So a lot of it has been a labour of love, and the books have been a labour of love.
Now, statistically, there were, of course, not too many black British broadcasters before World War II. There were perhaps only 10 or 20,000 black people living in Britain by the time broadcasting began in the early 1920s. So broadcasting was overwhelmingly a white man's game. But between 1922, when the BBC started, and 1939, say, how many black British broadcasters can you name? Try now. Can you name one? I'll let you off. I know I couldn't either. And I've been looking online deliberately and in books for such answers. So it was a joy to discover Stephen Bourne. He has been doing research that almost no one else has been doing. Stephen's books include Evelyn Dove, Britain's Black Cabaret Queen. Evelyn Dove is one name that we can mention. We'll come back to her later this episode. And he worked on a 2-part BBC TV documentary in 1992 called Black and White in Colour. So, a treat to bring him to you now. I will pop up now and then, but in these long-form summer specials, it's much more interview and much less of me. But later on, I will bring you a song from Cathy Toohan. She's a singer. Her other half, Graham Brown, is a listener to the podcast. Hello, Graham. Hello, Cathy. And they've discovered a song from 1913 called There's a Wireless Station Down in My Heart. And Cathy recorded it specially for this podcast. Coming up in about 20 minutes. But for now, enjoy an extended, incisive, informative chat with Stephen Bourne.
So I have been tentatively dipping in to the early 1920s and 30s radio times on BBC Genome and finding black artists and a black presence going right back almost to the very beginning. I've still yet to decide who the first was, but certainly around 1924-25 you had Layton and Johnstone, who were very, very popular African-American cabaret and stage review stars, and recording artists in Britain. They were American, but they were expats. They settled here, and they were on the radio almost as soon as radio started. So they were there. Lawrence Brown, who is someone I've written about in the Oxford Dictionary, was an African American. He was the one that published a lot of the early, researched and put out a lot of the early spirituals, what they used to call in the old days Negro spirituals. And he linked up with Paul Robeson in London in 1922. But Larry Brown happened to be gay. I mean, he was African American. He was an expat as well, and was a lot of his kind of arrangements of spirituals were being broadcast on the BBC, and he would get credit. But when he links up with Paul Robeson, they appear on BBC Radio in the 1920s onwards. And in fact, Paul Robeson's, for those who are not familiar with him, was probably the greatest black artist of his day, singer, actor, political activist. But Robeson is hugely popular in Britain. He makes London his permanent home from 1928 until the war breaks out in 39. And in 1938, I haven't been able to verify it, but some sources claim he was voted the BBC's most popular singer, which doesn't surprise me because on radio, because he did have that standing in this country. And then in 1939, he makes his one and only pre-war British television appearance in a short concert from Alexander Palace. There is a photograph of him with the BBC camera pointing at him. So that there is this going on, and from the 1920s onwards, it was easy to find like the classical black singers, like African Americans, the visiting African Americans, like Marion Anderson, who was a contralto, sang at all the great concert halls of Europe, including London. So I just type in her name and she comes up, I think 1929. From 1929, she starts appearing on BBC Radio. But she's a visitor, she doesn't live here. But from Britain, there's the lovely Evelyn Dove, who I've done masses of research on. And she was London-born, of an African father and an English mother, very middle-class background, highly educated, went to the Royal Academy of Music, hoped for a career on the concert stage, but the English concert stage wasn't ready for a woman of colour who was British. Marion could come from America, and others like Roland Hayes. African Americans could come and sing in our concert halls, but Black British singers were pretty much discriminated against. But that did not stop Evelyn Dove from having a career in cabaret and musical theatre, and she makes her first appearance on radio, BBC Radio, in 1925, and her photograph is in the Radio Times. She's very young, but she later has a lengthy career at the BBC Radio.
And there's the reason that I got in touch with you is I saw the link on the BBC100 items,
Yes.
isn't it? So tell us about that. What's the link between that and Evelyn Dove?
I own Evelyn Dove's archive and wonderful photographs, the scrapbook, but I allowed them to use a photograph of Evelyn's scrapbook from 1940, the 1940 pages, where she has her own BBC Radio series called Rhapsody in Black, with an African-American expatriate who made her home a permanent home here, Elisabeth Welch, who, if I may name drop, was a very dear friend of mine. And I did Elisabeth's archive. So I've got quite a few archives in my archive.
Mini archives.
So they came together. The BBC brought Evelyn and Elisabeth together to do this radio series in 1940 called Rhapsody in Black. Sadly, none of the programmes exist. But Elisabeth had been broadcasting on radio since she arrived here in 1933. And in fact, I think one can claim that Elisabeth Welch was the first Black artist to have her own, to be featured in her own radio series. And that was Soft and Sweet Music. She told me that it ran from 1933, I think, to 35. And it was because of Soft Lights and Sweet Music that she became a name from Land's End to John O'Groats, because everybody across the country heard her on the wireless, heard her singing in this very popular radio show where she sang with a sort of band. It was wonderful. And she did make recordings, like commercial recordings on 78s of some of her medleys that it's called Soft Lights and Sweet Music, the disc. You can find them on CDs.
And I read, I think, is it Elizabeth Welch is one of the first artists to perform on television in Britain as well, for Alexander Palace.
Oh, Elisabeth by no means was the first, but she was one of the first. In fact, there is a letter in her file at the written archives that state, I think it's 1937, and her agent writes to the BBC and says, sorry that Miss Welch wasn't available for television appearances from certain dates, from the very beginning up to beginning of 37, but she is available now. So of course Elizabeth, and in fact Elizabeth told me that she came from radio into BBC television, and she said that I was in at the baptism. She said because we go to Alexander Palace and they would paint our faces white, which was kind of odd, but she said they could see us on camera, and the camera was static. It moved forward. It could go in, it could zoom in and zoom out, but it couldn't move around. And it was live. She said everything was live, and we had to sort of just all queue up and be quiet in the studio as each one of us in the variety show or whatever it is she was doing would stand in front of the camera and sing the song. And in fact, I interviewed her for a BBC television documentary about that early experience of BBC television. But she was indeed in at the baptism, but there were many other Black artists in Britain at that time who had their own shows on BBC television before the war.
It's ironic the term of use of baptism, thinking of the wash you would get when actually you talk about the makeup being applied to
because they had to stand out on camera, because obviously in those days it was technically very crude. It wasn't anything other than that. But what coexisted alongside all these great artists, Paul Robeson, Elisabeth, Welch, Evelyn Dove, and many, many others in those formative years were the Kentucky Minstrels. So the BBC, one of the most popular shows on BBC Radio from 1933 until the late 40s was the Kentucky Minstrels. And it was blackface minstrels. And I don't know if they blacked up in the radio studio, but they perpetuated that kind of what we would now criticise as racist stereotypes. But it also provided work for black artists in Britain at the time. So the lead in this popular radio programme were an African-American musical act called Scott and Whaley, and Eddie Whaley and Harold Scott, and they were very popular. In fact, they were so popular on the radio in 1933 in this radio show that the following year they made a film called The Kentucky Minstrels, which has recently been rediscovered and put out on a DVD. I watched it only a couple of weeks ago, and it's quite an extraordinary film to watch. And they are the first black artists to play starring roles in a British film. Paul Robeson filmed the following year. He's not the first. They are the first. But it's a very low budget, rough sort of looking film. But it's a great kind of, if you're interested in that. And that series, Kentucky Minstrels, was the forerunner of what later became the notorious black and white minstrel show, which took off in 1958.
I think for many people, it's odd to think we're thinking of even before then, because that feels like old BBC, but actually decades before. This is the early.
Not only did the Kentucky Minstrels coexist with the more dignified presence of Paul Robeson, who also, I found in the Radio Times in 1935, this is why it needs more excavating, Alistair Cook. I think it was long before he did his famous Letter from America series on the radio, doing a program about the Negro in America. And it was a very intellectual kind of program. In the billing in the Radio Times, he's talking about African-American art, jazz music, politics, the whole thing. Sadly, again, the program doesn't exist. But even that early, 1935, the BBC are conscious that there's a serious side to black people's lives.
More from Stephen shortly, with more stars of that era of people of colour. But a quick welcome to new listeners. Thank you for being here. How have you found us, I wonder? If you're new, do get in touch. Say hi, paul@paulcarenza.com, especially if you have a little tale to tell of early broadcasting history. While I'm here, for the centenary itself, I'm looking to do something special on the podcast, of course. I'm looking for very brief audio snippets from you. If you would like to get involved and get your voice on the podcast, we're going to do an episode, 100 years in 100 minutes. It might be a two-part episode because it will be quite long. It'll be, 100 minutes. So I'd like you to pick a year, pick a broadcasting landmark, record a short voice memo on your phone of you talking for under a minute about that moment. Even 30 seconds or 20 seconds is fine, but ideally no more than 60. A moment of British broadcasting history. Doesn't have to be just the BBC, because of course it's the birthday of all British broadcasting. Commercial radio, television, satellite, whatever you want to focus on. So, do you want to wax lyrical about the birth of TV in Alexandra Palace? Could you tell us what Trumpton and Camberwick Green meant to you growing up? Did you witness the moon landing in 1969 or the end of Noel's house party in 1999? All equally momentous moments, I'm sure you will momentarily agree. So, record a thing, under a minute. Email it to me, paul@paulcarenza.com. Links in the show notes to how you spell paul@paulcarenza.com. And you can be on our centenary special later this autumn. Speaking of which, I think I'm now allowed to say I've actually been helping BBC HQ with their inquiries. That sounds rather police-based, it's not. No, a couple of official BBC 100 programmes have got a bit of my involved, so that's nice. There's an on-screen thing that I won't mention yet, just in case it's cancelled. And separately, I've been helping in an off-screen capacity as senior researcher for one of the BBC documentaries about itself. This will be the retrospective on the first 50 years of the BBC. So it's been great to be able to help them out with some research, not just on the early years that we've covered on the podcast, but also some post-war broadcasting nuggets as well from the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even the early 70s. From what I've seen so far in the documentary, I shall reveal nothing, but you are in for a treat. It will be marvellous. You will see some things you've not seen before from the BBC archives. I should say as well, leave your expectations at the door. There is so much to cram into a short programme space. They will undoubtedly not get in everything that you may want them to. Apologies. It's the way it goes. But appreciate the gold they're bringing you. And as for the rest I don't have time for, that is where we come in. That's what this podcast's all about. Because time means nothing here in podcast land. This is the perfect medium to bring you the full works of broadcasting history. Coming up, this episode, singing star Cathy Tuan performs exclusively for us one of the very first songs about wireless, 1913's There's a Wireless Station Down in My Heart. That is a genuine song and a genuine song title, Don't Go Anywhere. But more now from Stephen Bourne on the earliest black British broadcasting stars.
And looking at it online, like the original Dixieland Jazz Band tour, which was 1919, that came into Britain, but that just missed broadcasting. And then the Southern Syncopated Orchestra tour, 1919 to 1921, again, they just missed broadcasting. So unless there were some jazz bands around in 22, 23, 24 that...
But you see it changes in... Well, I don't know. I haven't really looked closely at jazz on early, or black jazz on early BBC. That's a really interesting subject to follow, but certainly in the late 30s, Ken Snakehips Johnson begins to broadcast. Now, Ken Snakehips Johnson is always erroneously described as a jazz band leader, but he wasn't. He was a swing band leader. There is a difference, swing music. But what Ken Snakehips Johnson was famous for was creating and putting together Britain's first all-black swing band, all-black music orchestra in 1936. They were originally called the Emperors of Jazz, hence the confusion. But then quickly changed it to Ken Snakehips Johnson and his West Indian Dance Orchestra. So they're up there with Henry Hall and all those Giraldo, all those greats that were on the radio. And he's on the radio. I mean, he's broadcasting live with his orchestra from the Café de Paris, where he was sadly killed in an air raid when it was bombed in 1941. And he was only 26 when he was killed. So you can imagine how young he was in 1935. But Ken was from a Guyanese middle-class background, was sent to England to William Boulez School when he was young to be a student. He was educated here. And his father in Guyana expected him to become a lawyer. But Ken visited New York and saw Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway and all these jazz greats, and came back to London and turned his back on law and became a band leader. But he had no musical ability. He couldn't play an instrument. I interviewed a couple of guys from his orchestra way back, about 30 years ago, and they said he couldn't play music. He just had the elegance and the charisma to carry it off. And that came over on radio. He would, although you couldn't see him or even hear him, his presence was felt. And they had their own radio series. They were broadcasting from the Café de Paris. I think he was scheduled to appear on television, but it was cancelled because the war broke out. But he was really, really famous. I mean, with Paul Robeson and Leslie Hutchinson, undoubtedly, they were probably the three most famous black men in Britain before the war. But that kind of music was sort of introduced. And in fact, there is one reference in BBC Radio, in the Radio Times, to Ken having his own radio programme in 1938, where he selected his favourite discs. I can't remember the name of the programme, but he was considered very important by the BBC.
Okay.
He was a showman, very charismatic, beautiful showman.
And I guess the BBC then was, to entertain people, was devouring artists.
Yes.
A high turnover of people. So this is the fact that you've got so many of these great performers. It's a natural fit for radio, isn't it, I suppose?
Absolutely. So they all appear on radio, but they all appear on pre-war television. So Naomi McKinney had her own two television programs, one called Ebony, another called Dark Laughter. She was included in the 1937 television demonstration film that the BBC made to promote television. So Nina's in there. She was another African-American star of film that worked in Britain at that time. Adelaide Hall, who again, if I may name drop, I knew very well. I own her archive.
Excellent.
I've got to put it out there. But right. she had her own nightclub in the West End, the Florida Club, and the BBC broadcast television shows from her floors at the Florida Club that she would take part. And so these were all great pioneering people. I mean, but mainly they came from radio. So it's kind of interesting, as Elisabeth said, once you became a name at the BBC in radio, it was just an easy transition into pre-war television.
More from Stephen in a mo. Great to shine a light on these people. Although we would be lying if we said that black people were at the heart of broadcasting. These were generally people who would come and go in a variety fashion as entertainers, as opposed to regular BBC staff members at this stage. But it's good to know that there were some of those voices on air giving us musical treats. But speaking of musical treats, time for an exclusive here. Now, in episode 32, you may recall Alan Stafford, our listener to the show, comedy history expert. He played a song for us. He discovered some sheet music. It was one of the first songs about radio called Everybody's Listening In. Well, inspired by that, listener Graham Brown got in touch. Graham is ex-BBC, and he's found sheet music for 1913's There's a Wireless Station Down in My Heart. This is 9 years pre-BBC. It's 7 years before any kind of broadcast radio station. So this wireless station down in my heart is more about communicating, telegraphy, the old-fashioned wire service. See Wichita Lineman for further details. Well, Graham has links, very strong marital links, with singer Kathy Toohan. She is from California. She's based in Orkney. So this is made there in Starling Recording Studios. But now, for the first time in many decades, lyrics by Ed Moran and Joe McCarthy, music by James Lee Monaco, and voice by Kathy Toohan. There's a wireless station down in my heart.
Oh, there's something nobody knows. I don't suppose anyone knows. Anytime that I'm feeling blue, I always know what to do. Postal cards and letters I just leave alone. Never have connections on the telephone. The way I get my lovin' is the finest system known. There's a wireless station down in my heart, and every flash just tears it apart. Some operator constantly sends his love to me when he thinks that I'm lonesome or feeling
Thank you, Kathy Toohan, for that song, 1913. How about that? And thank you, Graham Brown, for making her record it and sending it in. If you like what you hear, Kathy's released 5 albums, most recently Facing the Falling Sky, and her most recent single, This Time, Save the World. Links to that on YouTube and to Kathy's website is all in our show notes. You'll also find links in the show notes to the books of our guest this week, Stephen Bourne. Do check those show notes to go beyond the audio. Here's Stephen then with more insights into the very earliest Black British broadcasters on the BBC.
So, and then in terms of in-house people, it looks like Una Marson, 1941, when she takes over which becomes a producer for Calling the West Indies, I think it is, and then Caribbean Voices.
Yes. Now, this needs to be clarified because Una had started working for the BBC just before the war broke out, and she'd actually worked as a researcher and possible interviewer, I think, on Picture Page, the pre-war BBC magazine programme, and then became involved in, or was also involved in radio, so that by 1941, she was established at the BBC. Again, for people that are not aware of her, Una was a Jamaican feminist activist. She came to London in 1932. She was a playwright. She was the first Black woman that we know of that had her own stage play produced in London in 1934. So she was a poet, a wonderful poet. So she was very much in the politics and the arts of the time. But in 1941, she wouldn't have been known by the general public in Britain, because Calling the West Indies, which was the programme that she was assigned to as producer, the first Black woman producer at the BBC, was broadcast on the old Empire service, which later the BBC World Service. But from 1932, it was the Empire service. And those programmes, as far as I'm aware of, were not broadcast on the Home Service or the Light programme at the BBC. But she did do some non-Empire Service programmes. But she produced that series for several years. And when you look at the I mean, I'm a geek. I own every single copy of the London Calling. I managed to get them from when it's first. London Calling is like the Empire Service version of the Radio Times, the big red volumes. I love. I take them off the shelf and look at them all the time. Yeah. But what's great, the reason I got them was because years ago I was doing some research on the Black presence on the Empire Service, and so it tells you who were on. So Elisabeth Welch would have appeared on Calling the West Indies as a guest singer. You had some Welsh male voice choir. You had a whole politicians. I can't remember half of them, but they were all, and Ken Snakehips Johnson, one of the very few surviving recordings of Una Marson on Calling the West Indies is her interview with Ken Snakehips Johnson just months before he was killed in an air raid.
There's a lovely clip of Una Marson on YouTube. Link in our show notes. It's well worth your time.
And it's wonderful to hear her voice and him as well. So Calling the West Indies ran for many years, but Una was sort of involved in it during the war period and introduced at some point a segment of Calling the West Indies called Caribbean Voices. And this was absolutely vital to this story. So Caribbean Voices, the segment, enabled Una to have poetry and literature from the Caribbean read on the air. And so that very early generation of Caribbean, particularly Caribbean writers, Samuel Selvon, George Figaro, I mean, all these wonderful people. And I did interview an actress called Pauline Henricus, who broadcast a lot of the early generation of Black actors would get work on Calling the West Indies, reading the poetry or little playlets. And Pauline met all these amazing people in the late 1940s when she started broadcasting. So it opened a lot of doors for Black artists and poets and literary people in this country. That was the Caribbean Voices segment. And a lot has been written about that. But Una was the one that triggered that off. And in addition to Calling the West Indies, just very briefly, she also made a program, I think it was called Voices, during the war. And she was on with T.S. Eliot and George Orwell. So the BBC considered her, not as a producer, but as a as a poet, as a literary figure. So she was up there, but she was very quickly, as so many of these people were, very quickly forgotten.
Loads of names here that I'd never heard of, and it's just great to hear them being talked about, isn't it?
That's what I do. I introduce people to people they've never heard of.
That's fantastic. Well, the nice thing is,
people.
Indeed. And the nice thing is that then from this, people who might be able to hear this and in days, months, and years to come can hear these names and they look up more. And because you've written various books on, like Evelyn Dove, you've written.
On the books. Let's do the book plug.
I did
write when I inherited all this or acquired all this Evelyn Dove material, photographs, scrapbooks, records, her silver medal from the Royal Academy of Music. I mean, it's a wealth of stuff. I did manage to get a biography published. So the Evelyn Dove biography was published by Jacaranda Books in 2016. But also I've tried to cover this story. So Black in the British Frame, which was published 20 years ago, includes a chapter about Black artists on pre-war television. My more recent book, Under Fire, Black Britain in Wartime, the Second World War, published a couple of years ago, includes a whole chapter about the Black presence on BBC Radio during the Second World War, which, in addition to Una Marson and some of the other people that I've mentioned, there were Black classical composers having their music played, including Phila Shawande from Nigeria and African-American composers. The BBC were, I think, showcasing these artists and composers, and they don't give themselves enough credit for it. They think it's all black and white minstrels and Kentucky minstrels, and it's not. So much wider, diverse. And that's the interesting thing about the BBC as an organisation. They were culturally diverse in those times. And I've tried my best to acknowledge this in my work and to get this story out there. And some people have connected with it, but I don't think my work is as well known as it should be, which is why I'm very thankful that you've given me this opportunity to talk a little bit about it. But that's nothing to do with me. It's to do with the subject matter, and because it fit with the perception. This is why my books have been overlooked in certain respects.
Well, I do hope that they can be appreciated anew, because it does seem quite easy to think of us, back then as being less enlightened times, and therefore, less. When I saw the BBC, centenary coming up, you sort of think, is it going to be a lot of Morecambe and Wise and David Attenborough and going, well, there we can talk about them. There's various Radio 1 DJs that we can't talk about, and there's various other parts of history that we daren't open that particular cupboard closet or.
It is this fear of the unknown, but the fear that this BBC centenary history, the early years, is going to throw up a lot of pain and racist attitudes. And you see, as early as 1941, the N-word was used in a broadcast on BBC Radio and caused a lot of offence. And we had a black community leader in this country called Dr. Harold Moody. So Dr. Harold Moody fired off a letter to the BBC complaining, and he got an apology and said it will not again. And I think that was one of the last times the N-word, an announcer got away with it, or didn't get away with it, the BBC. I haven't looked at any files at the BBC about the use of racist language, but certainly the BBC were much more, I think, liberal in some respects than people give them credit for. Certainly, although I don't want to move outside this time frame, certainly by the late 50s, you've got some wonderful white producers called John Gibson, Betty Davis, Jeffrey Bridson, and a lot of the black actors and actresses from the early years that were working at the BBC then, that I interviewed way back in the 1980s and 90s, told me that they created work, they created opportunities for black writers to write for BBC Radio and television, mainly radio, because they were on the radio side. And that created work for us. In fact, a couple of black actresses, friends of mine who were from that generation, they said we referred to Betty Davis, Betty with a Y, nothing to do with the Baby Jane actress. She was known amongst black actors as Black Betty. I said, why did you call her Betty, they said because she was always creating work for us, and we were thankful that she was giving us work on BBC Radio. This was in the late 50s and throughout the 1960s. So Betty Davis needs to be looked at very closely, I think, in terms of race. So there were downsides, that there were dodgy attitudes and programs which perhaps shouldn't have been made. But I'm always looking for the positive stories, because narrative that has never really been given enough attention.
Yeah, I remember looking a few episodes ago now on the podcast, we were looking at late 1922 broadcasting. There were a couple of songs broadcast. I can't remember the titles, but they were unmentionable. Let's just say that.
I know there will be because they were what people enjoyed and what people expected. But there were also lots of black composers being broadcast as well. Samuel Coleridge Taylor, the Black Accordion composer who died in 1912. He was famous for Hiawatha's Wedding Feast and all these great compositions. They were going right back to the 1920s. His music was included. So a lot, as I say, that alongside the racism, there was the progressiveness and the acknowledgement of black talent, and that needs to be addressed, to be looked at more closely during the centenary period.
It's certainly something that came up in my chat with Dr. Kate Murphy on Early Women at the BBC, was the fact that because this is such a brand new industry, the fact that BBC arrived as literally the ability to broadcast arrived. And so you had this thing of, well, why not start afresh? Why not welcome women as well as men? Why not welcome black talent as well as white talent? And it's open to everybody because it's a whole new industry that they could set the rules from the word go, I imagine. So everyone's welcome.
Also, I discovered that pre-war television, in terms of entertainment programs, the BBC could easily find cabaret artists in the music halls, artists in musical theatre to come into Alexandra Palace and do television and broadcasting as well, radio and television, but also television. And so, a lot of West End shows had black artists in them, Elisabeth, Welch, all these great people. And they would be brought into television because they were established in the West End, in the kind of field, and so and the BBC did not discriminate. They did not say we're not going to have any black faces on television. Far from it.
I feel we've barely scratched the surface.
We have barely scratched the surface. It's a huge, huge subject, but let's keep our fingers crossed. The BBC acknowledged this presence in their history during their centenary period.
I wish I were an official BBC podcast.
So do I.
But instead, we're an independent thing. But the only benefit
good for you
is that we will keep this online far longer than hopefully if it were a passing thing on a BBC Sounds thing, it would come and go. But this will hopefully be here for many more years yet. So. Amen to that, absolutely.
Yes.
So if people were to find you online, they can find you online, find your books, find more information on
yes, I do have a website.
Of course.
www.stephenbourne.co.uk, but Stephen with a PH.
Excellent. And do they start with any book, or do we start with the most recent, or just delve into
Well, I think in terms, I haven't, The Black in the British Frame is out of print, sadly, but Under Fire has a chapter about the BBC in it, and the Evelyn Dove book has a lot of material in it. If people are interested as an introduction to the subject, then yeah.
Great. We'll put the link to that in the show notes, which I'm sure.
Oh, thank you.
So there you go. Thank you for joining us. Much appreciated.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's it from Stephen. That's it from me. Check out Stephen's book, stephenbourne.co.uk. That's STEPHENBOURNE. All in the show notes to save your spelling. While online, do find us on Facebook and Twitter at BB Century. Consider supporting us. Patreon.com/Paul Carenza. From £5 a month, you'll get videos. You'll see heritage walks near old broadcasting landmarks, behind-the-scenes monthly written updates, all sorts of other extras await you there. On Patreon.com/Paul Carenza. Thank you if you support us there. You keep the podcast going. And next time, it does go on with our third summer special. A voice you will surely know if you've heard Radio 4 in the last couple of decades. Edward Sturton, World at One, Sunday programme, plenty else beside, author of Auntie's War. He will give us an overview of the BBC in World War II, plus I'll be smuggling on some David Hendy and some Tim Wonder next time as well to give us an insight into what the BBC was doing then. All of those people, David, Tim and Edward, all have books, so for your summer reading, get a book from one of them. Or from me, I've got So a Comedian Walks into a Church or Hark, the Biography of Christmas. They're two that I would point you towards if you like a bit of cultural history in the latter, or my memoir in the first. Or our guest, of course, this week, Stephen Bourne, has many books to inform, educate and entertain us. Thank you, Stephen. Keep telling those stories of yesteryear's forgotten stars. Thank you, Kathy Toohan, as well, for the song, and thank you for listening. Stay subscribed, tell your friends, tell your enemies, as I now tell you that the British Broadcasting Century is presented and produced by me, Paul Carenza. Original music is by Will Farmer. We're nothing to do with the present-day BBC. This is a solo operation, so thank you for spreading word of this mighty project. We are small, but we have amazing stories to tell, as I hope you've enjoyed in this episode. We seek to inform, educate, and entertain. Well, edutain, they would say nowadays. Ugh, kids and their words. Join us next time for our last summer special on Auntie's War with Edward Sturton on the British Broadcasting Century.